Awesome.
Hello, welcome to the Strange Academia podcast, where we talk about the weird and wild things that we've been researching. We're your hosts. I'm Emma,
And I'm Faith.
and let's get into the discussion of a crash course on horror literature through the decades and how it has affected the stigma affecting fans of the genre, and why it is actually a good genre and actually a lot of fun and deep and not just dumb little monsters running around.
This is just hitting cringe culture immediately.
Totally.
It's actually good.
It's so good. So, like, I was always interested in horror because I was super into Halloween, and so it just grew. I got super into, like, gothic literature, and then I got into, like, the obvious horror novels and horror films. But I didn't, like, talk about it with very many people until, like, I got into college, and it was slightly more accepting to bring up these things, because when you're in, like, high school, and you say, like, I'm into horror movies, you're automatically that weird kid who wears like the weird shirts and like you have like a vibe to you that no
Yeah.
one like you're a little like dangerous and a little suspect, which isn't the thing because like horror movie people and horror fans are like the nicest human beings ever and are just super weird like me. And so instead, like now when you're an adult who's into horror, people just think you're a super morbid human being who like just has like black walls and like candles everywhere, super dramatic.
Oh, yeah. You're waiting for the full moon.
I'm just counting down the days. So this all kind of started with Gothic literature, which really kicked off during the Romanticist period in like the late 1800s. So you got things like Dracula, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and all these very like high level, like scary
Classics.
stories that were like super deep and cool and people actually like analyzed them and they would read them, but it was still considered like more of a male thing to read, so women a lot of the time got like
Sure.
sidelined if they tried to get into it because they say like, oh, you're too like your constitution's
That's
too
too
weak,
scary.
your nervousness, like you're just gonna
Your nerves.
you're just gonna faint. And so it became super popular and it kind of like it kept going through the early 1900s, but it kind of slowly died off because there was just like a very time and place for those kinds of stories. And it's starting to come back now. But at that time where it was like all these new wonderful things being discovered and society changing, it was really cool to have like a monster that's a corpse put together or just like a really cool suave vampire from
You want to
Transylvania.
see what we can do with science?
Yes, it was all about science. They were like the Victorians were obsessed with science and like the macabre science of things. So they're like, wow, yes. Or like mad scientist has dual personality and like is an evil like murderer by night, but like a super meek little scientist guy by day. And so they were super
Yeah.
into that. And a lot of like horror scholars mark the end of like Gothic and the beginning of horror after World War I, because we as like Americans had just like obviously not people who were still in America, but those who had went over and fought in the war. So all of these atrocities that they had never seen before. And it was like you had like the mustard gas and like everything and battling in trenches and just tons of blood and gore. And so we had to find a way to cope with that, which is how the genre was created in the 20s with like silent films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari became popular, as well as just some like tiny little like novellas about the war, but it was like subtly about the war.
Sure.
And so we see a shift into horror as in being about like monsters, and this goes clear till the end of World War II, because we as
Interesting.
humans like things to be very black and white. We want the bad guys to look like bad guys and act like bad guys. So we have like the monster stories coming out, like the universal monsters, which are like the big ones, like Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolf Man, Invisible Man, Phantom of the Opera. They all come to the forefront because they all look scary. And in literature, it does the same. We get a lot more novels about monsters and just like creepy things that we can be like, that's clearly the bad thing. And so as long as we're
Sure.
not like the bad thing, it's good.
Was it so in Gothic? It's just more about like people and concepts, and then
Yeah.
after that, it gets into monsters.
Yeah, Gothic, like there's monsters in it, but it's more like highbrow, I guess, compared to just being like, ooh, spooky. So like the ones that the monsters are based off of are those original Gothic stories, but we just take them and boil them down to their most basic elements.
Just the scary parts.
Yeah, we just keep like, here are these beautiful women in white dresses and these guys in suits, and then there's a vampire, or like there's Frankenstein. And
Who's
so we don't
also
really
wearing a suit, but we
humanize
don't need to get
anything.
into that.
Yeah, we don't
Sure.
humanize absolutely anything. We're just like monster, humans, and like clear line
There's
down
a
the middle.
chasm.
And the only thing that really broaches into like humans being bad is the Shirley Jackson starts writing, and she publishes in the 40s her piece The Lottery, which is basically drawing names to see
I
who's
remember this one.
yeah,
I
it's
know
like
this one.
drawing names to see who's gonna die in the town. And so that talks about like
Fantastic.
humans being awful to one another.
I mean, that's the quickest way to get rid of evil in your society is just pick a scapegoat and freaking go at it.
Yeah. And so
Obviously.
we had that, and then like we had the short film Freaks that came out, and it was about a literal like at the time freak show, and they cast like actual people who had actual like disabilities and looked different than other people to play these characters, but they made the beautiful woman in it the villain. And so you're rooting for all these people who is typically be the monsters in these films to win and destroy like these two perfect human beings because they're exploitative and awful. So those two things
Love
are like
that.
the only thing that break from like that very black and white, like literally and metaphorically, like monster stories where it's just like, ah, yes, giant like mummy guy, probably bad. And so now we have like gray area and ambiguity, and we are uncomfy with that as human beings.
This is what we're getting into.
And then
I
we
love it.
switch up into the 1950s, and we kind of like break the typical monsters, but not really, because then we just introduce ghosts and demons as reasons for why things are bad in literature. And so we have like stories like that. So we have The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, which is like known as one of like the greatest ghost stories of all time, and all these modern horror authors mention that that is like their inspiration. And then we also have Fear of Nuclear Fallout in the 50s. So we
Yay.
get a lot of like monster stories, but they're just like taking things like giant ants and things like that
Oh,
that are just like
so
creatures that
literally
have
just
grown.
nuclear.
Yeah, it's just like
Fantastic.
the absurdity of nuclear war, not like even the actualities, like what happens later in like the 80s with those kind of like
The things
made
that
for
actually
film
happen are
movies.
kind of worse.
Yeah,
But we're just gonna
and they're like,
focus on the gigantic animals.
we just love giant spiders so much.
Yes.
And so we see Shirley Jackson still the queen at this time with modern horror, and like some
Good
authors
for
just do like
her.
little one-offs throughout it. And then we also see a trend of like, so the 50s was a time of like nuclear families. We love like the picture perfect like sitcom family a lot during that
White
time.
picket fence.
Exactly. And like the dad leaves and gets all the money, and the mom's baking in the kitchen. There's like two kids, one's a girl, one's a boy, and they have like a dog.
Blonde hair.
They're perfect. And then so we start seeing things that like break up this idea of like family. So we get Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which brings in aliens and kind of science fiction influence back into horror. And then we see The Bad Seed, which is just about a child who like goes and murders a bunch of people, just like evil from the get-go. And even though she looks like the perfect little, like she has a little frilly white dress and little braids.
And that's the scariest thing of all.
Yeah, I'm like, that's terrifying. And then she's like coming at you. Mm-mm. And then we have The Hunger, which is about, it's kind of like a vampire story, which is what it gets turned into when it becomes a film. But it's also just this idea of like this immortal, like building your own immortal family idea, where like, we'll be young and beautiful forever. And it's also
Building
the
an
idea of like,
immortal family.
yeah, and you can't have
Whoa.
kids because that's just
Oh,
a caveat
that's
on being a
illegal.
vampire. So like, they're not having children. No.
Oh no.
So then you see a lot of protests now popping up about horror because it's starting to blur the lines and getting even more uncomfy for individuals, because now like the family's under attack, and if like kids are watching these, and it's always about children with these types
Oh
of
yeah.
things, we got to protect the youth.
Protect the children.
And so we have like people protesting and picketing outside of movies, or like throwing books away, or like having meetings, like town meetings regarding like books coming out and how to like
And
keep your child from
this is
seeing
the
them.
this is the
Because
like attack on the family. This isn't what it's supposed to be, people.
yeah, and like the authors will be like, actually, I was just writing about aliens that come and take over people's bodies. And like, well, you're
I
wrong.
love that. They're
I know,
like,
I'm like, that's
why did
fancy.
they choose this color for the wallpaper in the story? It's like maybe they like the color blue,
Yeah, it's like they
or
were just
maybe
really
they
into
just
that.
wanted to write about aliens.
I know, and love like that's just keeps going because like horror authors, like some will say like, yes, this has a deeper meaning to it that I had intended, and others will just be like, no, I just thought that was weird, so I wanted to write it.
I just want to see what would happen.
Yeah. Then 1960, we get
Let's
the
go.
movie that changes up the genre entirely, Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. And
Yeah.
it's based on a book from the 50s that no one barely read because it was marketed as horror, but Hitchcock markets it as like suspense and like a psychological thriller, even though it's totally a slasher.
Flip it on them.
And so then
Yeah.
people are like shocked, and also everyone's terrified because now is gone the time of monsters because he made a human totally evil.
He was right.
So he has Norman Bates, and so now that makes a huge shift in the genre because now we don't have to be just writing solely like spooky like ghosts or things like that, and obviously that continues because it's traditional. Same with monsters, but now there's going to be more stories focusing on like the human aspects and how we as humans are capable of awful things rather than being like we are separate from what is considered horror.
Right.
So we get good old Psycho, which revolutionizes both film and the genre entirely without being marketed as such. And of course, we still have ghost and demon movies, but they're highly stylized now. They're made to look really like visually stunning, and the books themselves are like very like
Interesting.
deep and have all these different like layers. It's about like family, it's about like trauma, and so people are like, ooh, that's highbrow now. It's not just like ghosts running around slamming things shut. And so we have
We've
Rosemary's
got
Baby by Ira
subplots.
Levin, which is about the spawn of the devil, literally. And she's like the perfect woman.
Fantastic.
And
Thumbs up on
it's a,
that.
yeah, it throws again that whole idea of destroying like the typical family. But Rosemary's Baby was like received super well, the book,
Oh, what?
despite it being super against everything most of these people who are very anti the genre were, because it was like the book was written super easy to read. You can read it in like a sitting, despite it being like over 100 pages. It's
Wow.
like a conversation piece to have read the book, and it's like considered very like classy
It's
because it takes
classy.
place in New York City in one of like the most beautiful apartment buildings. And so,
Wow.
and like Rosemary's described as being like super stylish, and she gets the pixie cut in the book, which she does in the movie too. And then the
Oh,
movie just
yes.
cranks it up to a new level with like all these artsy shots, and like it's an art house film basically. So people regard it as being like one of the best horror things ever because it's just like made to be so classy and beautiful.
Because it's shot like a commercial.
Yeah, it's just shot to be very artistic, and it's written to be super like literary as opposed to like how like slashers and stuff were written at the time, or even compared to like Shirley Jackson's how her writing was perceived at the time. Because Rosemary's Baby out the gate is considered like literary and a classic. Shirley Jackson took up until like the 80s, 90s to be considered like classic
Mm,
literature or like literary at all.
interesting.
At least her spooky stories, because she does write some about her family, and it's not spooky, it's just like a memoir. And then that was considered like super well thought out and like a beautiful piece. Also in the 60s, we see that films are being inspired by the books that are being written. So now these books, as with anything, once a movie's coming out about something, everyone has to read the book.
You
So you
gotta
see
read
an
the book
uptick
first,
in
at
all of these,
least.
yes. So you see like an uptick in people like get checking out and buying these little like paperback horror novels and having to read them because the movie's getting a lot of buzz or has like famous actors or actresses in it. or they saw the movie and now they're just like engrossed in this world and have to read the book. So
That's
book
a
sales
mood.
go way up.
Yes.
And then we hit the 70s, which is just a time of super social awareness. So we have social issues entering the genre. So like with Jaws, which was originally a book, it tackles the idea of capitalism because no one will close the beach because it makes too much money, even though the shark's killing everyone.
What does that sound like?
And then it was regarded as like somewhat communist, the book, but then the movie became like one of the highest grossing movies of
Communism.
all time. And then we have a bunch of responses to Vietnam, both in literature and in film, which are the slasher movies. Because Vietnam was highly broadcast across the United States, you could watch it and watch people get killed on TV
Jeez.
because leg time sometimes wasn't the quickest. And so we are seeing like all of this gore in our houses. So then the slashers just completely blow that out of proportion to exaggerate it, but also kind of discuss it. So we see
Yeah, and
some
that's
books
kind of what
doing
you gotta
this.
do.
Yeah,
You
to
know,
get
if we're
people's
dealing
attention.
with that kind of thing, it's gotta be like, look, I know this isn't exactly what's happening, but this is how I'm gonna consume it because I can think this isn't what's actually happening.
Yeah, and then they could be like, "Oh, I hate this movie. It's awful." Or I hate this book. It's awful. But then they could be like major supporters of the war, which then the author's like, haha, hypocrisy.
Gotcha in a catch 22.
One of like the greatest like no one barely knows that this is what the movie's about, but the director Toby Hooper came out and said it was Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an allegory to the Vietnam War. And everyone,
Really?
yeah, because like the whole point is that they're like out of gas because there was a gas shortage during the time. That's why their car breaks down. And they come across this family that's only talking about like wars and like battles they've been in. And it's all these like human atrocities and like body parts and things. And these are all like hippie kids that would have
Oh
like been
my
against it.
goodness.
And also it's remembered as being way bloodier than it is. There's like virtually no blood in that movie. But everyone remembers it as being like the slasher because it kicks it off after Psycho does it.
Sure.
And then so we have like those, and then we have the scariest thing for some people, the civil rights and women's rights movements.
That's the beginning of the downfall in America.
Yeah, oh.
These people don't know their place.
So we get like the women's rights movement response to it, which is like a wonderful thing. Same with civil rights movement. Love it. Most people did. But
Most
then
people agree that's a good thing.
but then there was enough people who didn't like it that authors saw their chance to like terrify them even more.
It's like the comedians that go alt right when they can't get money anywhere else.
And so we get like the women's rights movement. We get Ira Levin, who wrote Rosemary's Baby, comes up with Stepford Wives, which is about women whose husbands turn them into robots. And they're very like progressive women for the time. Like they're all into women's liberation. They're all into the Equal Rights Amendment. They all have careers. And they move to this idyllic little town. And one by one, they start becoming like the perfect housewives. And then you find out that they're like being turned into like basically animatronics from Disneyland. Like it's
Don't like
not
that.
them, like it's ambiguous what the husbands are doing, but all you know is like the lady who breaks in sees that there's these animatronics that look like the ones from Disneyland because one of the guys in the book worked at Disneyland and they look like the women.
He's like, "Yep, that's an animatronic, all right."
Just a good right turn from Disneyland into like awful, which is also the whole point is like they're making Disneyland sinister now because now when you go in at this time and see the animatronics, you're like, I remember Stepford Wives.
Ah, interesting.
We're also getting more international influences at this time in horror because the Italians are super into it. They're making giallo films, which are like very highly stylized and beautiful visually, but also super bloody movies. So books start mimicking like this style as well, with trying to be like ultra gorgeous in like their writing, but also being like super dark.
but just kind of really gory.
And then a lot of like Asian cultures start making their versions of horror films and their versions of horror literature. And obviously that influences a bunch of writers and screenwriters over here in the United States to try to mimic it. not to the best successes. Like, these international influences in literature are not that great. They try, but they're not, they don't make it like the ones
It's
that are
not the
like,
real thing.
yeah, they try. We also see based on a true story coming out.
Love those.
And so the book, The Amityville Horror, comes out, and everyone's like, this is crazy. There's poltergeist activity in this house. And like the owner of the house had written this book about how he like almost murdered his family because in the past some other guy had murdered his family in the house, and it's like cyclical or whatever. And then it comes out that he like
Of course.
made it all up for money. But we see
No.
those getting
Who would
transformed
do
into
that?
films, which, as we mentioned earlier, when something gets made into a movie, the book skyrockets. Everyone has to read it.
As it should.
So we see a bunch of those, and then we see a bunch of like based on a true story that have like no book associated to them. So then people are like, that's not great. So then publishing houses start publishing movie tie-in books for these films, like
Wow.
just little paperback ones to be like, look, it was a story and now it's written.
That means it's real.
Yeah, it's published. And then 1974, we finally get him. Stephen King publishes
Our
Carrie.
man.
The guy, the
Stephen King
legend.
himself.
And Carrie's his first novel, and it was a response to women's lib, but on the side for women's liberation, because he writes about a girl. It's also anti-bullying, and he mentions that he thinks the scariest thing in the world are like teenage bullies and how awful they are to kids that don't fit in. Because he was a weird kid who didn't fit in, so he always identified.
He's
And so
on
it
something.
starts with a girl getting her period, and so it's a commentary on like why this makes men uncomfortable and why this would be like a horror scenario for men, because there's blood throughout the film. Like, she gets the pig's blood poured on her, and in the book that happens too, but even more detail. And she like kills all of the kids at her high school, and King refuses to call her a villain. He thinks she's a hero and that she did what she had to do.
Really?
Yeah, and so he gets labeled as this is like his hit. Like, he had written short stories throughout his writing career before that point and had them published in journals.
Sure.
But Carrie comes out, and it's a super short book, and it skyrockets his name to fame. And then he's going to publish Salem's Lot, which is his vampire novel, next. And his editor, his publishing house, and like a bunch of his friends, like, if you publish Salem's Lot next, instead of a different type of story, you're going to be labeled as like a horror writer, and then that's going to like lessen your popularity significantly and have all these groups coming after you.
He's
And the
just
man
gonna call the
publishes Salem's
psychological
Lot
thriller.
next. And
It's not
he's like,
horror.
I don't care. And so he publishes Salem's Lot because he loves that story quite a bit. And so now he's labeled a horror writer.
Good for him.
And he considers himself a social commentary horror writer. Most of the time when he was lucid, he did. And he has addiction problems throughout his life, and which also gives the fandom kind of a negative connotation as well, just because you have this guy who's like has like cult leader status amongst fans, and he is
Sure.
high out of his mind almost all the time.
But are they good books?
Debatable. But some are really good. He's a hit and miss throughout his time of writing, but he considers some of his best ones, Carrie, as being commentary on like women's rights and women's body and feminism. And The Shining's a commentary on alcoholism, which he had just like battled and kind of gotten through. And so he wrote about that and how it affects families. And so he considers himself to be writing books that are like related to problems, especially problems for children, because he's like, that's the scariest time of your life is when you're a kid. And so like Pet Sematary is about a child who comes back from the dead, not the same. And it's about grieving and grief for the father. And it's about like he has like a sister, and it has all these family dynamics in his stories, and about friendship, because that's always at the heart of like all of his books. Are almost always like this group of like friends, and they're bicycle kids, so they're riding their little bikes everywhere together. And then he has like a major cultural impact, obviously, because he's still like the number one author you think of when you think of this
100%.
genre. And so at the time, he got banned by quite a few libraries for his books, as well as like had a bunch of people like picket his literature and like would go to his signings and stuff and freak out. But he also had like a
So
huge fan
angry.
base, so it didn't really matter or impact sales at all because people still wanted, even if they hated him, wanted to read the book to see what was happening and what they could say about it.
I have to know so I can that's what you say if like your friends aren't into it. You're like, I just need to know so I can be mad at him later.
You have to justify it, just
Yeah.
rationalize. Like, I'm reading this because I don't like it. And then we also get a revival of the Gothic in the late 70s. Anne
Let's
Rice comes out with
go.
Interview with the Vampire in 1976, which brings back Gothic, but in like a very American sense, in the like deep South American sense. And that like vampires are these
Heck yeah.
aristocratic like southern plantation owners that can live forever. And that just brings back all of these monster stories. So in 1979, like classics, like Signet Classics published like a huge omnibus bind-up of Dracula,
Ooh,
Frankenstein, and the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And Stephen King wrote the foreword to it because
legend.
he's the man. And so we have a Gothic revival in the late 70s. It's short-lived, but it's a moment where everyone wanted to read all that because like vampires became super popular again in the 70s because of Salem's Lot and Anne Rice. So everyone
See,
wants to
that
read
just proves time is
Dracula.
cyclical.
Yeah, and
Everybody wants vampires all the time. It
true.
keeps coming back.
It's a story. Same with like mad science and things like that. People are still fascinated by science and like all the weird things it could do. So that comes back, but obviously those like Frankenstein, Dracula doesn't really get a ton of scholarship attention for a while, but Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde get a lot because obviously the monster in Frankenstein is like a tragic hero figure, and so that gets a total revival. Also, the Mary Shelley and her and of herself gets a huge revival because she is a strong
Yes.
female writer.
That's our girl.
Yes, the woman. And then Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde gets a lot of it for like mental health focus because now we're having to deal with the PTSD coming out of Vietnam. And so we get a more focus of that in that book, but Dracula is still just spooky vampire book for a while.
Yeah.
And then so we get like this really high class, like highbrow revival in the 70s of like the books of the past and the monsters of the past. That goes away in the 80s very quickly because we get into pulp and camp in the 80s because we're just here to have a good time.
Oh, absolutely.
So we get like those like stereotypical like horror novels with like the really weird covers, and they're all like paperbacks because only Stephen King really gets hardcover books.
You either got the really sharp font,
Oh
you
yeah.
might get like
You get like a
the
weird like
droopy
ooze or
one.
blood drip coming
Yeah.
from it, and then there's always like a girl with like a mirror or like a skeleton or like this weird like monster
Or
figure,
the
and they're
skeleton in the mirror.
yes, that
We
is
just don't
popular.
know.
And so it's like a time where all these books are coming out and they look very much what they are. And of course we have like the classic authors still going and still publishing very original ideas, but like the pulp and camp books are just a time. They match what's happening in popular culture with horror movies because they're starting to go way more into the horror comedy scale where they're getting really campy. It's more about like having fun and having like a huge absurd body count, and then but in like the weirdest ways possible, like getting pulled through a TV screen or turning into a cockroach. Like it's not deep.
We're just getting creative. This just throw it on the page.
We're a big fan of like sequels and long series at this time because we have a formula now for what sells and what people find amusing and are willing to read and watch. So we
Sure.
get books that all are very similar in content in such a weird way. Like there's a book and it's about a like cane that gets passed around. The cane's evil. And there's like a bunch of evil doll books
Kane
because
is
that's
evil.
also something we as humans gravitate towards.
Yeah.
We love a creepy doll.
Love a creepy doll.
And then we get Final Girls in the 80s, which are the last, they're a super strong, intelligent woman who survives the horror situation and either escapes or kills the monster figure in the scenario. And so we get Final Girls, and they first are really cool and they become really tropey. So you can really figure out at the very beginning
Sure.
which one of these are going to make it to the end. if it's like the quiet girl who's like super studious and isn't super popular, but she's super smart and kind of sarcastic, she's gonna make it.
Yeah, as long as she's just a little bit snarky.
Oh, she's a little bit snarky and she's going to pull through, but that comes into literature as well, as we get these really strong female characters, but they all follow kind of the same pattern. So they're like
Sure.
arguably feminist characters, because the first several definitely are, but after a point it just becomes a pattern, because we know that with Final Girls we get a lot more female involvement in the genre and more openly about it. And then also like male involvement also broadens to include like LGBTQ communities and people of color, because you now have these like protagonists that don't fit the mold of what is like considered the ideal in by American standards, or
Heck
isn't
yeah.
inclusionary. And so we get a lot better role models in horror quickly, because they're everyone's equally a victim in horror, but also everyone's equally a villain or equally a hero. So it just shows like a wide swath of possibilities, rather than just being like, this is the typical hero figure, this is the typical villain, these are the victims. And so
Yeah.
we get like a lot of good breaking of tradition in the 80s with a bunch of weird stuff as well. And it becomes like the most popular genre during the 80s, because of like the films at first are scary and you still like go to see them to get scared and you still read the books to be scared, but you also go because you've seen the first three or read like the first four books in this series. You're committed now.
Yeah, that's exactly us with the MCU.
Yeah, it's like you don't need to see the rest because you know what's going to happen and you know the patterns at this point. But you have to because you've done it for this
Gotta.
long and you want to see a resolution, because that's
And if
not
they
always something
make
you.
another Cats movie, we have to go see it now.
Yes, we have to go see the sequel to Cats if it comes out because you're committed to that lifestyle now. And
It's
so
a
those with
sunk
like the.
cost fallacy.
Yeah. And so like now with horror, people want to read all of the books because they like the adrenaline rush you kind of get out of reading the book. So that's the big appeal, is you can kind of live vicariously in these dangerous situations without being in actual danger.
I love that.
So it gives you like that adrenaline rush and like that feeling, and then but you're fine. Like you're in a safe situation and nothing's probably going to happen to you.
Probably.
There's just as a promo, like someone just comes out with a hook. But they have that good time. We get comedy, so that widens the audience, because now people can be like, this is ridiculous and super funny. Let's go see this, like Nightmare on Elm Street 5 or
Oh,
something.
let's go.
And so it gets to become a good thing, or like books get super campy, and so that's always fun and amusing, and it becomes more of like a social gathering, because now we see like horror entering like musicals and on the stage and having like viewing parties of like
Sure.
Rocky Horror Picture Show where people go and yell things at the screen and are super involved. And so it becomes like this weird like communal situation where everyone's in the moment together, and so it's also this sense of community that you get
Yeah,
with
if you
the
get
genre.
scared together,
And like if you had
that's
like book clubs in Reddit, you could all discuss things, which that becomes super popular in the 80s, is like groups of people. It's more like a subculture doing this rather than popular culture. But they start having like horror movie like nights and like horror book clubs and having a good time that way, so they can all share the experience together, which is cute. And the
very
horror
good.
paperback becomes like the standard. Like I said, like hardcovers go
Like the
to like
little
the main
ones.
authors, like Stephen King, or like
Sure.
reprints of like Shirley Jackson or the classics. You get hardcovers, but because it's considered like more elevated than just those like pulpy paperbacks. But also that's part of the appeal, is like you get a really cheap paperback at a store and get several of those.
Yeah, there's so many of those like on the spinning rack on the end of the aisles.
Yeah, it
You
becomes
just gotta
super
scroll through.
accessible. You can just grab a bunch and have a
Yeah.
good time, rather than only being able to get like one book. So also it's very cost
Stephen
effective to
King
be
and
a
the
fan.
freaking what dictionary sized.
Yeah, they're huge. And so not everyone wants to tackle like Stephen King books, but if you had like a book that's like 200 pages long and has like a mummy coming off the cover, like, okay, I
That's
can do
pretty.
that.
Yeah.
But in the 80s, we still want to protect our children. So
Oh
in
yes.
California, there's this big scandal and they blame it on Satanists. And so this gets super huge and makes it to like mainstream television news. So a journalist called Geraldo Rivera hosts it, and you can watch this on YouTube still. Like it's still out there, this discussion, because it's kind of infamous, as in like literally every horror textbook ever, or like every like novel that takes place in the 80s and is like a horror novel mentions this. And he hosts this thing where he talks about like how people who are interested in the genre or interested in like hard rock music are probably like evil cult members and are gonna like murder
If
their
you
family.
wear black.
Yeah, that's basically it. He's like, do they wear all black? Do they have a candle in the room? Do they listen to Ozzy Osbourne? Have they read Stephen King? Your child might be in a cult.
Might be a Satanist.
Yeah, and they might kill you. So you know what we as Americans call this time period in the 80s?
That's our satanic panic.
Satanic panic.
Yeah.
And it is such a weird thing. And so it affects everything like horribly. Like obviously the people who are super into the genre, it still skyrockets and still popular with them. But now you have like people hosting like book burnings of horror novels and protests at movie theaters, which we've had in the past. Like when The Exorcist came out, people protested because people came up with ridiculous stories of things that happened to them after seeing the movie or during the movie that didn't make sense. And like I think one person like had to have an appendectomy following it, and he said it was because of the movie, but then like his family's like, oh, but he had been having appendicitis for several days like he'd been having like side pain for several days. And so we get
unrelated.
Another one of those where people are protesting authors. They're going to like book signings and throwing things at them and making it really hard, especially for like Stephen King can put up with it, but also
he's seasoned.
Also he has a lot of
this.
like, I think at this point he's like also still, he's very much addicted to different things, so he also doesn't remember a lot of this time, but he puts up with it. He still goes to all the signings, but this really turns off like newer authors from going out or continuing writing.
That's so sad.
So you see a bunch of authors who had had several successful like those pulp books start like pulling back and not writing anymore. A lot of publishing houses quit publishing a lot of these authors
because
in their
people
works.
wanted to believe that Satan was in their daycare system.
Yes.
And now we lost how many horror writers?
Yes. And so we lost all these people who are losing jobs, and like it's still popular with like the fandom that was always into it, but it definitely closes the gap now where less people are apt to mention that they like horror or apt to like go out publicly and see a movie, especially if people are protesting outside of it, or go see an author that maybe they admired, because people are out there protesting. So that brings us to the whole idea of protecting the youth is the main thing with horror, is that we just, as a society, don't want children reading those stories. But also the monster movies are still super popular because people are still saying those are good though, because that whole idea of it being fine, like not human at all or have anything like mystical to it. It's just like, this is a vampire. Vampire is bad. The humans kill the vampire. Humans are good. Good always wins kind of thing.
Yeah, it's the whole only when, what is it? Only when lions have historians.
Yeah.
They cease to be the heroes.
Yes, and so it's like, it's challenge for the genre to come back from it, mostly the literary genre, because the films, obviously, if you have money backing it, you're probably okay, and same with those bigger authors have like a lot of money backing them at this point that they can kind of risk it. But a lot of these authors either like quit writing horror entirely or switch to a different genre or get like quote unquote real jobs compared to writing something, because it's like the genre that gets looked down upon the most for writers. It's like romance in the fact that like if you say you're like a romance writer, if you say you're a horror writer, you're immediately pegged as like not that good compared to other writers.
You're writing out of your parents' basement.
Yeah, it's like you're lonely. You don't have a lot going for you. That's part of the stereotype too, and it's super unfortunate because like a lot of horror writers are just like upstanding citizens that you would see on the street. Same with romance novelists.
Yeah.
But they have such negative connotations to them, which turns off people from reading them or people from writing them. So we get into the 90s, we get like meta horror, which is just like super self-aware novels that like make fun of the genre and the tropes, and we get films like Scream and Wes Craven's New Nightmare, where it makes fun of like the standards of horror and like the rules of it. And then we get a continuation kind of the paperback phenomenon, but now writers who have been writing adult horror novels or teen horror novels turn to children because they're gonna
Goosebumps.
go for it.
Yeah,
And
that's a whole
so,
untapped like market right there.
yeah, like kids
Is the
love monster
children.
stories.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Give them a little Frankenstein.
Just a little.
Just a little.
And then so we get R.L. Stine writing the Goosebumps series, which becomes
Yes.
super famous for kids because it's just fun, scary stories, and kids kind of naturally gravitate towards weird, fantastical things. And that's
That's
just
true.
basically, horror is just basically an extension of fantasy. It's just a little darker.
Just a little bit.
Just a
But you're
tad.
right.
And then we get like scary stories to tell in the dark. It's super popular, been written prior, but now kids with Goosebumps really want to read more. So we get those stories. And then there was like a journalist, as she was had a daughter who was like 9 or 10, and her name was Randy Dixon. And she wanted to know why her daughter liked these books so much more than any other books. And this like journalist did not like horror. She was one of those people who didn't think it was appropriate for kids, but she let her daughter read because her daughter wasn't a huge reader to begin with. But like Goosebumps
Mm.
got her super into reading because it's just super engaging. So this woman went interviewed all the kids in her daughter's class about why they liked these books, and then she figured out it's because kids like characters that feel, because again, as Stephen King said, childhood is your most vulnerable time, like
Yeah.
it's the scariest time. So they liked other people going through scary situations that are kind of absurd, and they especially liked how in these books the protagonists were A, diverse most of the time, and B, like people close to their age
Their
having to tackle
age.
things and showing autonomy and showing independence despite still being like a child and being able to conquer something.
Yeah.
So that brought on like a whole new like set of fans for the genre, which is now being seen as these kids of like the 90s and early 2000s grow up. And so now the genre is getting super popular. Like first time debut authors now are citing this as like the time that they discover that this is their genre. So we
Very
get
good.
Goosebumps, which still carries through. It's still super popular today. Same with Scary Stories Tell in the Dark.
Oh
We
yeah.
we hit the 2000s and it's pretty much a void. Like the films aren't great, and then also there's really no books coming out other than like the children's horror novels and the ones by
Hmm.
like popular prominent authors. Like there may be like a one-off hit that happens, but it doesn't happen often enough that the genre really stays too much alive. It becomes kind of like the joke genre that's now trying to break out of again. Hasn't reached it completely plummeted from its height in the 80s and 70s as being like this really popular, cool like genre that was like testing boundaries and everything. Now it's kind of just like like it's there, but not much is happening. So 2000s is basically dead for horror.
That's just,
Like you get a bunch
all
of
right.
really long series that are going,
That's your
just
time to
like in
catch up.
yeah, just like in the 80s though, like the long series just get to the point where it's just more campy and you understand what's happening. Also, this is like post 9/11, so we have like new fears for the public, and horror does not want to tackle those fears because they think that they're kind of unfounded in most cases. So then we get to the 2010s to present, and we are now in what is being called a horror revival because
Let's
we're getting
go.
all of these really highbrow horror novels coming out. We still have Stephen King rocking it as per
Oh yeah.
always. He's better now. He's lucid. He knows what he's writing.
He's doing great.
He had a couple rocky patches, some books that didn't go over so well, but he's doing well now. And then we have like film started bringing back the literature into popularity again because we start getting like the remake, because it's has like an A+ cast and is super well thought out. The Conjuring, which has beautiful cinematography. We have Get Out, we have Midsummer, we have all these movies that are now like not being marketed necessarily as horror, even though that's what they are. They're being like psychological suspense. So it's basically the fact that marketing has like evolutionized for these things to get a wider audience in to see them, and they become conversation pieces again. We'd only really seen that in film with The Shining and Silence of the Lambs, because those were the only ones that like really made a mark and had like a huge swath of people coming in to see it, rather than just kind of a niche and then like teenagers. And so horror no longer looks like horror in the literary world. Like some do, but you don't have those fun pulpy covers really anymore. It's very
Yeah.
highbrow. The books don't really look like horror novels. They're very bright colored. They're really doing that thing where
Not
you have
gonna
like,
lie, kind of miss it.
yes, you have like the bright cover and then like just the stark white text on the cover with like something
Yeah.
ominous.
Like
And so
some
like it's being branded as literary horror now rather than being like
literary
super
horror.
spooky. And they're still great, but that's kind of like now people are less apt to say those are horror novels because they don't fit in with the stereotype of what they are. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword where more people are involved, but they just don't realize they're involved in the
Sure,
genre.
this is like a double-edged sword
Yeah.
for horror.
And
We're
so like
on.
the covers
That's
don't
exactly
look
what you just
good.
said. What was I gonna say? Sorry.
It's fine.
Oh, we're in the middle of like rebranding it then?
Yeah, we're like rebranding horror and like there's people out there, Grady Hendrix, who's one of my favorite like modern horror authors. He writes very campy, like very 80s feeling horror novels where they're super weird. One's about like a haunted IKEA. One's about like a rock band that like the guy sold all the other members' souls without letting them know, and they have to try to go get it back. One's called My Best Friend's Exorcism, which takes place in the 80s and it's just super campy and it's just funny. And then there's Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which is about a
Nice.
90s women's book club that has to try to kill a neighborhood vampire to protect the children. And so he
Protect the
writes this,
children.
but he started a company called Paperback Horror, and it was originally a novel where he just went through like the popular like pulp covers and it's like these were really cool books, but they're not being published anymore. So he found his own independent publishing company that's getting all the rights to these books to republish them with the original covers. So
Nice.
he's doing that, and then there's another group that's been create another independent publishing house that's taking modern horror stories and giving them those covers. So you can buy like the
Yeah.
sleeve to put on these books that's like very like pulpy and like creepy and what you would expect from like 80s like 70s like horror novels with
Yeah,
like
those are just
modern
fun.
spooky stories, and it's really cool. And so we're kind of getting that return to past horror a little bit, but also we're getting more diverse. Like a lot of the time in the past, like a lot of the authors were white and predominantly male, but they tried to have somewhat diverse characters, but obviously it's not done well when it's not like own voices telling the story.
Sure.
So now we're getting a lot more like diverse. We're getting more people of color writing horror novels from that perspective. We're getting more women authors writing about horror, getting more LGBTQ authors. We're getting more authors of different religions and different races and backgrounds, and it's so cool, and
Yes.
disabilities. And so we're getting a lot wider swath of what horror can look
Perspective.
like, which is really neat. And so it's just all about now how they're marketed. A lot of them are marketed as like literary or like psychological suspense type stories
Yeah.
compared to horror. Not children's though. They're still very clear that they are spooky
This
stories.
is a spooky book. It's in the title.
Like the Goosebump books got like rebranded, but like the covers are just as like weird as the originals.
As
Like
long as it keeps the text.
you just have like the dummy sitting on the chair. More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark got recently rebranded to be like not have like the crazy drawings that were in the originals that were like
Aw.
nightmare fuel. So now they're much more like appealing drawings, not like angry scribble drawings of like
Oh, I
monsters,
see.
which is a little depressing, but it's still a good book. And now kids are really
Yeah.
obsessed with it because of the movie that came out. So the current like apprehensions regarding the genre is that it's despite getting more popularity, is changing too much and kind of losing the feel and the aesthetic that the original kind of had. So
Sure.
now fans are like, it's cool and there's really good horror stories, but no one's ever going to really like consider if you say I love horror, they're going to still have a very specific image of what you read. They're not going to consider like the more highbrow elevated elements as being a part of the genre. So when you say like I love horror novels, they're gonna be like, okay, so you read like Stephen King, you watch like Nightmare on Elm Street,
Yeah. Just all the
blood and gore is
popular.
like your thing, rather than be like, oh, you like dark academia, or oh, you like the classics, or
The
oh, you read
classics.
psychological suspense. they're going to just peg you back into that pulpy era, because that just so, like, because of all the stigma coming out of satanic panic and all of these ideas coming out of like the 50s that just kind of built off one another, it's still like the idea that that's not something you should like talk about liking if you like literature. That's not really literature. It's more
Sure.
like just fun, lowbrow comedy kind of books that don't really have any significance, despite a lot of them being social commentary. But overall, more people are being more willing, and the community's super big now with the internet and everything.
Growing.
There's like conventions where like these authors who've like never
Horror
like come out and
convention?
met people are coming to these horror conventions and signing books because they didn't
That
get
sounds
to.
fantastic.
They're selling like pulp. Now people are making like VHS covers for DVDs that look like how the VHS designs would look or how the posters would have looked. So it's
That's
gotten a
cool.
lot better in many regards, and the fact that more people can feel comfortable talking about it. It's just the fact that not a lot of people are super into it. But I think there's honestly like a horror story for everyone because the genre encompasses so many subgenres that like there has to be something for everyone out there, regardless if you're like, oh, I'm a scaredy cat, I
Yeah.
could never read. Like you could read horror fantasy and it's basically just like fantasy but with like,
It's just regular fantasy with weirder monsters
yeah,
sometimes.
yeah, it's basically it. Or like the villain's just a little more evil. Like a child might die at it, and then that's a big thing.
Yeah, and then that's a whole thing.
And then so we have that, and then you can read anything. Like I know at the library, a bunch of patrons will come in and be like, "I'm going to start horror. Where is it?" I'm like, "That is not what you start with." I'm like, "That is
Give me the
absolutely not."
horror Bible, please.
I know. I'm like, "Please don't pick the 1,000-page book that Stephen King doesn't remember writing half of it." I'm like, yes, it is a good movie. Watch the movie, but don't start with the book. Or like they want to dive in immediately with Stephen King because they think that that's the be all end all of the genre and that's it.
Right.
And you could be
They
like,
think they
okay,
can
but what do
only
you
read
like?
Stephen King.
Yeah, because there's like horror mysteries. There's like time travel books about like catching Jack the Ripper and things like that. So it's like you might as well like pick something that you would usually read. There's even like horror romance. So I'm like, there's really just like you could take any genre and put horror next to it. I'm sure there are books there. So there's something you like. And if you're not super into gore, most books are more aesthetic based now than
Yep.
gore anyway.
It's the suspense.
Yeah, it's more about like the moment and the feeling and the vibe to the book rather than being like, oh, I want to read about a lot of blood and guts. Because that's not really what's happening. There was a time and place for that, but we're not there.
No longer.
Because there's like books like that, but you don't register that they're that bloody when you're reading them because it's more like, this is a beautiful scene. These characters are so in depth. So you don't really get that sense of fear, or at least I don't when reading them. It's more just fun. They're just a fun thing to read, and it's a
You're
good break
just
from reading
being an
like,
English nerd and
yeah.
analyzing the book first.
I'm like, ooh. Yeah, and like if you're ever like caught up in like a series and you need to pick something that's like a palate cleanser, like a good kooky horror novel is a lot of fun. Like it doesn't have to pick a deep one. You can pick like a fun little like kitschy book to read. There's plenty. Like Grady Hendrix, his books are like so good and so well written, but they're all horror comedies. So it's not bad because they're just cracking jokes anytime it gets super weird, so it doesn't matter.
That's the vibe we're going for.
We just want weird stuff with jokes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's enough horror out there that I think if people got past their like preconceptions of what it is, like obviously there is like the crazy horror novels that like if you're not into it, don't start with those.
Yeah.
And like you obviously don't have to read them because there's several that I wouldn't even really read or would appeal to me. And I'd read pretty almost anything.
Whoa.
Yeah, oof. And I'd read pretty much almost anything from the genre, but I have my lines that I draw. And so there's something for everyone. Like I know a lot of people don't like monster stories, but those are always fun. And like I said, kids like them. And
Yeah.
then teens, you have just the whole paranormal section is basically horror, but they label it as something else.
That's true. Never thought about that.
Yeah, in stores and in libraries, they label the teen horror section as paranormal because that was
Paranormal.
the whole craze for a while, was
Because
werewolves and
teens
vampires.
like ghosts.
Yes, teens like romantic involvements with like monsters and like
With the
vampires and
ghosts.
werewolves and ghosts and aliens
Yes.
and the fae, and it's a whole thing. And like start small. You can start with like children's or teen books. You don't have to go into the
Yeah.
adult ones. Like the Goosebump books are still very fun and very appealing, even as an adult, because they're just so weird. Like there's one about like a camera that kills people when you take pictures of them with it. Like where else are we going to get that in any other genre?
You're right. It's very niche.
Well, that's been a basic crash course on how horror, the genre, both in film and literature, has kind of changed over time and how we kind of got in with that stigma that kind of still sticks with everything. It kind of hovers over. But also it's showing some promise that like these books are super accessible to almost anyone and that there's a ton of starting points to get into it. And you obviously don't have to dive in with the heavy stuff. You can start small. And just remember to be nice to your neighborhood horror fan because they're probably a really good person and they just like to read and watch some spooky things. So this has been
Exactly.
our first episode of Strange Academia on a crash course on horror novels. Goodbye, and we
All
will
right.
talk to you soon in your ears.